with energy as part of our banking strategy.
Many thanks, and my apologies to those whose questions remain unanswered this afternoon. We will now move to the next item of business in the debate on motion number 8407 in the name of Alex Salmond on the Independence White Paper. I invite members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now, and I will now call on the First Minister, Alex Salmond, to speak to and move the motion. First Minister, 14 minutes or thereby, please.
Deputy Presiding Officer, and I have great pleasure in moving the motion in my name and that of other members. In next year's referendum, the people of Scotland will be asked to choose between two futures, between taking the future into our own hands or continuing to allow key aspects of Scottish life to be controlled by Westminster governments, often, like now, governments that have been overwhelmingly, decisively rejected by voters in Scotland. Now, yesterday, the Scottish Government published our vision of a better Scotland, across 670 pages and 170,000 words, addressing 650 questions. Scotland's Future, your guide to an independent Scotland, sets out we can build a fairer, more prosperous, more democratic country. It is the most comprehensive blueprint for independence, not just published for Scotland, but for any country, anywhere, at any time. Now, a lot of the response to it was sadly predictable. Well, on the basis of sadly predictable, I'll give way to Mr Rennie.
Thank you for those compliments from the First Minister. Talking about other countries in the world, can the First Minister tell me whether his government, his ministers or his officials have received any feedback from any other EU country about Scotland's membership of the European Union, and whether they have indicated at all that that would be difficult? Can he tell me precisely whether he has had that feedback?
Well, the Secretary for International Affairs is briefing the Consular Corps today, so I'll arrange for Fiona Hislop to give a full briefing to Mr Rennie and put his mind at rest. But on the question of sadly predictable, there was some sadly predictable reaction from the Better Together camp. Within an hour of this publication, Alistair Darling described it as being totally ridiculous, not of any worth whatsoever, which amazed me, incidentally, because I must congratulate that man on speed reading, because by my estimation that is 3,000 words a minute that he had managed to assimilate before he gave his carefully considered reaction to the White Paper on Scotland's future. The reality is this for all of the Better Together parties: the ball is now firmly in the Unionist court. They need now to provide answers to fundamental questions about if Scotland contains and maintains in this Union. Yesterday's debate did bring us to something very important in terms of Scotland's future. This morning, Aileen Campbell and I visited the Cowgate Under-5 Centre, a few hundred metres up the road from here. It provides a fabulous service to more than 50 children of all ages, from 6 weeks old to 5 years old. The Cowgate Under-5s was established in 2002 when all 3- and 4-year-olds became entitled to preschool education and care. At that time, the entitlement was 412 hours per year. That increased to 475 hours in 2007, when this government came into office, and will rise to 600 hours next year. But the government's ambitions are much, much greater than that. As was outlined in the White Paper in the first budget after independence, we will commit an extra £100 million a year to extend these 600 hours to almost half of Scotland's 2-year-old. By the end of the first independent Parliament, we will invest a further £600 million, enabling all these 2-year-olds and all 3- and 4-year-olds to receive 1,140 hours of care and education each year. In the longer term, our ambition as a country is to make these levels of care available to all children from the age of 1. It is a step that would benefit more than 200,000 families across Scotland, giving families a total saving of up to £4,600 per child per year. Now, what I want to discuss, and I'm going to give way because I know that we'll get on to this discussion. What I want to discuss is how this is linked to independence. Why this policy, this transformational policy outlined in the White Paper, is a policy which is about independence for Scotland. I give way to Gavin Brown.
I'm grateful to the First Minister for giving way. Given that he says the price tag for Phase 1 is £100 million, why has he not done it already?
First Minister.
Because when and if the Conservative Party ever come to this chamber telling us where they're going to save £100, which budget, £100 million, which budget they're going to come to and which. But of course the budget is not £100 million to do what I've just described, it's £700 million. £700 million, and let's remember, the Conservative Party have already committed themselves, I think, to a reduction in income tax, which will grow another vast hole in the Scottish budget. But I want to say where we'll get the £700 million from independence, and then I'll be delighted to hear from the unionist parties where they're going to get it under the current settlement. Well, one point is the point Patrick Harvie made in this chamber yesterday. Independence gives us the opportunity to make choices, to spend less on weapons of mass destruction and more on educating our children. There are other ways to get £700 million. In the theme of something for nothing exploration of society, you could gain £700 million by cutting, if the Labour Party so wished, free personal care for the elderly, scrapping prescription charges, scrapping entirely the concessionary fare system, perhaps being studied by the Cuts Commission of Joanne Lamont. That could get you £703 million, but these are not policies that this government would do, sacrificing the great gains of devolution. The reality is that that sort of investment can come about from the economic growth, later on, economic growth and expansion in the economy by a rise in female participation in the workforce. A 6-point rise in female participation in the workforce, giving rates in Scotland up to Swedish levels, would bring more than 100,000 women back into the labour market. I give way to Joanne Lamont.
Joanne Lamont. But surely the point is you need to invest the money in order to let women work and then get the resources, which means you have to get the money up front, which means you need to invest immediately. You could do that now, surely.
First Minister.
I thought whether we were going to get an explanation of whether it was concessionary travel or free personal care, which was in the target of Joanne Lamont. That's exactly why we identify the savings from cutting the weapons of mass destruction in the Scottish budget. But it is the case, if we can achieve that 6% rise in female participation, something which is entirely achievable, given over the last year under this government there's been a 3% rise in female employment in Scotland, then of course we would get huge increases in revenues. Closing that 6% percentage gap, for example, between ourselves and Sweden, would increase Scotland's economic output by £2.2 billion and raise taxation revenues across the range of taxation by £700 million. At present, those tax revenues, any savings, of course, from lower welfare payments, go straight back to Westminster. In an independent Scotland, we would retain and be able to invest these savings in the future of Scotland's children. A childcare revolution is the sort of transformation impossible under devolution that we can only imagine. With independence, it's one that we can implement. Now, Alistair Darling, in a second. Alistair Darling displayed all of this last night in Scotland Tonight. He said, as employment in Scotland rises, quote, those taxes go to the Treasury, which in turn come back to Scotland because of the way the funding works. This man was Chancellor of the Exchequer. Does he not know that the Barnett formula concerns spending, not revenue? If revenue rises in Scotland, it disappears into the maw of the London Treasury, is what happened at that point. And just in case there's any dispute about this, the IPP are not a think tank associated with independence. Indeed, they don't support independence, as they make it clear. But in their blog last night put out this statement. The SNP is right, however, that many of the fiscal benefits would flow in the form of increased tax revenues and lower benefit payments to Her Majesty's Treasury. So that is the difference between controlling the balance sheet of an independent Scotland, both on the revenue and spending side, and being caught in the straitjacket of Westminster, where we are at the present moment. A straitjacket, of course, which is going to get a lot tighter under the Conservative Party.
Ruth Davidson.
I'm interested that the First Minister mentioned the think tank, the IPPR, who also stated last night the Scottish Government's long-awaited white paper is a piece of fantasy economics. Other than a contentious assertion that the tax base north of the border is stronger than the rest of the UK, it is unclear how any of this can be paid for.
First Minister.
Well, exactly what the point I made in terms of the IPPR not supporting independence. That was the point I made. But on the question of revenue, they say the SNP is right. Now, of course, there's been an assumption of the Unionist parties.
Order.
Well, this is part of the heart of this debate. We have demonstrated through an expansion in childcare, a transformation in the opportunities for children in Scotland, an increase in the participation rates of women coming into the workforce, that revenues would flow into the Scottish Treasury under independence, which would enable that transformational plan to be funded. What we want to know from the Unionist parties is how does it happen under devolution without the dramatic cuts from Joanne Lamont's Cuts Commission on things like free personal care, things like concessionary travel, and no doubt student fees would also be in the target line. Now, the assumption has been so far that if we don't have independence, then everything will continue much as it is. What I want to say and point out now is we can see that's not going to be the case. Alistair Camarco at STV in the last UK general election campaign, the Secretary of State for Scotland now, we do not want to see Barnett. We do want to see Barnett scrapped. Last weekend, on Sunday Politics, he went even further. There will be no action taken on Barnett until the economy has stabilised again. Well, given that George Osborne tells us the economy is stabilising, we must think that is sometime soon. Ruth Davidson telling The Sun not to quote on the Daleks and Doctor Who and the BBC, but the quote on Barnett was only supposed to be temporary. I do think a review of Barnett after 2014, the ground has shifted since devolution. And we know that Labour won't fight for the current funding levels for Scotland. Just 2 days ago, a report was published by the Westminster All-Party Parliamentary Group in Taxation. The report recommended, in the case of a no vote, the Barnett formula must be replaced as a priority with a needs-based formula, the best alternative using the 7 indicators of relative need identified by the Holtham Commission. Well, we now know exactly what's in mind from the all-party group supported by all of the Westminster parties, because we know exactly what the Holtham Commission recommendations would mean for Scottish spending. They published it in an article in the Financial Times in July 2010. It would mean a cut in Scottish spending of up to £4,000 million a year. And of course we could say, well, that's just one proposal. The STUC, for example, estimate the cut might be £2,000 million a year. The UK Government won't give any commitments or indications about what will happen to the Barnett formula if we remain in the UK. But that stance of keeping it quiet till after the referendum is unsustainable. The Government has set out our case for an independent Scotland. What we want to hear from the Unionist parties, the Better Together, is how big is the Better Together raid going to be in the Scottish budget if Scotland votes no. That's the reality. Certain things we agree on, Presiding Officer. We agree and we know that over the last 30 years Scotland has contributed far more in relative terms to the UK budget than we've received back. We know in the last 5 years that amounts to £12,000 million, over £2,000 a head for every man, woman and child in this country. We know that Scotland contributes 9.9% of the UK's taxation and gets back 9.3% of the spending. But the reality is that 9.3% is going to be targeted by the Better Together campaign. They are going to cut Scotland's budget with no reflection or understanding of the massive contribution that Scotland has made to UK finances and will continue to make. So when we have the debate about the vision of Scottish society laid out in the White Paper, no longer is it going to be contrasted against a silence from the Better Together campaign. It's going to be contrasted against a future where they see low growth in population, low growth in the economy, and Scotland subjected to the severest cuts in political history over and above the retrenchment of the last few years. Or alternatively, we can go forward to a growing economy, a growing society. We can transform childcare for our children. We can benefit from the revenues and strength of Scotland's natural resources. We can combine these resources with the population's intelligence and ingenuity and create a new society. Politics are about choices, and the choice next year will be between that new society or the future offered by Better Together, which for many Scots will be no future at all.
I now call Joanne Lamont, Ms Lamont, to speak and move. Order. Ms Lamont to speak to and move amendment number 8407.1. Ms Lamont, you have 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I rise to speak in this debate and, of course, move the amendment in my name. And I have to say to the First Minister, if that is him being positive, heaven help us. Heaven help us when he decides to turn negative, because what it shows, of course, his speech entirely in tune with his worldview, rooted entirely in negativity and grievance. All of his political life, he wants to free Scotland from the United Kingdom, and that is his view of what the rest of the United Kingdom wants to do to Scotland. Presiding Officer, I understand that the First Minister has started quoting Nehru on national identity. I wish before he published the White Paper he had taken on another quote of Nehru's, and that is, "A theory must be tempered with reality." Without that, his paper becomes more of a wish list, and he appears more like Nero. There is a case, which, although I don't believe it, can at least claim to be a coherent case for independence. It is put by the First Minister's former deputy, Jim Sillars. It involves Scotland having its own currency and not being a member of the European Union. If you truly believe the First Minister's mantra that the best people to govern Scotland are the people who live and work here, then that is what you would follow. That is what you would follow. Alex Salmond certainly used to. When he said sterling was a millstone around Scotland's neck. Now he is claiming ownership of that millstone and demanding the right to wear it still. The First Minister claims that his White Paper is full of detail. I have to tell them there is an enormous difference between a lot of detail and a lot of words. Far from being tempered with reality, this White Paper is assertion-rich. Let's look at what it says about the pound. Page 85. Scotland will continue to use the pound. Well, let's imagine that is true. I didn't realise it would be quite so true to form at every opportunity. Let's imagine it's true. We would then have an independent Scotland which relied on a foreign bank and foreign taxpayers for our currency, a foreign parliament from which we had withdrawn Scottish representation would draw up the rules. This independent Scotland, I don't know if you haven't realised this, this independent Scotland would have its interest rates, its tax policy, its spending policy, its borrowing limits set by a foreign country. It would be the greatest loss of sovereignty for Scotland since Edward invaded in 1296. But that, of course, is if we could cut a deal to keep the pound. Yesterday, Prime Minister David Cameron said such a deal was highly unlikely. In saying that, well, he is entitled to his opinion, I expect, in these negotiations. In saying that, he echoed the words of George Osborne and Ed Balls and, of course, Carwyn Jones, the First Minister of Wales, who equally has an interest in these matters. Even if they agree to it, the likelihood is that the people of the rest of the United Kingdom would require a referendum to join a currency union, just as they would if they were to join the euro. Imagine Scotland's future currency dependent on a referendum in which no Scot would have a vote. And how would a politician persuade the people of England, Wales and Northern Ireland that the Scots who had just left them should keep the pound, especially since the Scottish Government's case to leave is because the rest of the United Kingdom has held us back ever since the Union was created. And if they needed evidence of that view, they only had to listen to the First Minister's speech there. The idea that you would abuse the rest of the United Kingdom for how they've done us down and then go back to them and say, could you do us a favour and let us share our currency, simply beggars belief. We would need them to agree to the lender of last resort. That would mean if a Scottish bank needed a bailout, it would be English, Welsh and Northern Irish taxpayers who footed the bill. The Bank of England is funded by taxpayers, but Scotland wouldn't pay any tax to the rest of the United Kingdom, so wouldn't pay a penny. How can the First Minister think anyone north or south of the border believes that deal could be done? Even the First Minister's own former economic adviser, John Kay, says that a deal for a separate Scotland to keep the pound would be incredibly difficult to reach. He says the whip hand would be with the rest of the United Kingdom. Professor Kay, who the First Minister trusted to give him advice on the economy, says the conditions the rest of the UK would impose are likely to be too restrictive to be desirable. Alex Salmond's economic adviser says there would need to be a plan B, a separate Scottish currency. But in this white paper, we have a plan A, which is not tempered with reality, and no plan B at all.
Derek Mackay.
Can I thank Joanne Lamont for taking the intervention? I realise we're almost 6 minutes through the speech and I haven't heard a single thing that Joanne Lamont happens to believe. Can I ask, do you believe that pernicious taxes, illegal wars and regressive immigration policies is a price worth paying to stay within your beloved union?
Joanne Lamont.
That is just completely ludicrous. So, on this most basic part of this plan, for all its 670 pages and its 170,000 words, this white paper cannot say what currency a separate Scotland would have. And let's remember what Professor Kay said about the fundamental argument which runs through the whole white paper. Professor Kay said, I think people who talk about what independence would be like in economic terms need to get beyond vague aspirational statements of a rather ludicrous kind that in independent Scotland we would have the powers to tackle poverty in Scotland. He went on, nor should we devote much time to arguments for independence, which are of the kind that an independent Scotland would have lots more money from some unexplained source and would therefore be able to avoid making choices about taxation and spending and debt, which rather unfortunately have to be made in the framework of the United Kingdom, or indeed in any framework, if you let me finish the quote and then you can maybe respond, or indeed in any framework other than that which characterises cloud cuckoo land.
First Minister.
We've set out a plan for a transformational change in childcare in Scotland, one that will cost, over the term of the Parliament, £700 million a year, and we've explained how that transformation can be paid for in terms of increased revenues for the Scottish Exchequer. Can Joanne Lamont tell me how such a change in transformational change in childcare, with all the benefits that has for Scotland's children, how could that be afforded under devolution?
Joanne Lamont.
You know, if it were transformational, if he believed it was that important, he would start now. And the First Member, the First Minister.
Order.
I think the First Minister only very recently has discovered the issue of childcare. Let me tell him, it is something I have understood all of my working and personal life. That is why I offered to work with the First Minister to establish a childcare commission to look exactly at how we would fund the issue of childcare right now, and I offer him that in good faith now. I work with him on his budget to make sure that childcare was properly funded. It's simply not. Well, let us meet and we'll discuss it. You're the man with the budget. Order. I'll take that.
Order. Let's hear Ms Salmond.
I'll take that as an agreement that he will meet with me. We will look in the budget at how we fund childcare. But of course,
the members in their last minute. First Minister.
And she came forward with no proposals how to fund anything. How will you pay for a transformation in childcare under devolution?
Joanne Lamont.
We have a £30 billion budget. I am happy to work with the First Minister.
Order. Order.
Well, what I've said to him is, he has a budget. We across parties will work with him to deliver childcare changes now. Clearly, the First Minister thinks this is a killer point. I am very committed on the question of childcare. He should be too. Put his money where his mouth is and make a difference right now. Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer.
Order.
If this debate were not so serious, it would be entirely laughable. It would be entirely laughable. We have a white paper that does not answer fundamental questions about the currency and about the European Union, but does manage to answer questions about what my home phone number will be and what will we call this country after independence. The First Minister mistakes words for answers, and the people of Scotland will understand it. The reality is, better childcare, reform of the council tax, relieving the victims of the bedroom tax. We could do all of these now if he were serious about making this Parliament work. But a can-do attitude doesn't sit with this government because their case relies on saying what they cannot do. It is a theory of a nation not tempered by reality. This is a government which promises better childcare if we vote for independence, but in 6 years hasn't been able to deliver an extra hour of PE for our children. It has been argued that this white paper is all pros and no cons. Well, I disagree. The white paper is littered with contracts. Scotland deserves better, and Scotland will see through it.
I now call Ruth Davidson. Ms Davidson, you've got 6 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, much has been made of the size of yesterday's white paper, 650 pages, a weighty tome. The Unionists' secret weapon, Joan McAlpine, even said it made America's Declaration of Independence look like a post-it note. It really was a case of never mind the quality, just feel the width. And it's not just a vast Unionist conspiracy that says so. It wasn't just the think tank, the IPPR, calling it fantasy economics. The Institute of Chartered Accountants slammed it for shining no light on the pension problems. And no doubt Shona Robeson was straight on the phone to the cartoonist at The Independent this morning. In fact, for all the trees that perished in the making of this document, there's very little in here that's actually new. Childcare, yes, and I spoke about that yesterday, but the other new piece of information is the Scottish Government's cunning plan for a route into Europe, followed up with an 100-page document today. Never mind that the Commission President, José Manuel Barroso, stated categorically last September that, and I quote, "If a country becomes independent, it is a new state, and if there is a new state, of course, that state has to apply for membership and negotiate the conditions with other member states." Despite, absolutely.
John Mason.
I wonder if the member could confirm that under her government at Westminster, the UK will definitely be in Europe in 10 years' time?
Ruth Davidson.
Well, I can absolutely categorically state that we will give the people of Scotland a choice, something the First Minister is not happy to do because he does not trust the people of this country.
Order.
He likes referendums on everything
Let's hear the member.
apart from the European Union. And despite José Manuel Barroso's categoric statement in September, and despite the head of the club saying there's no shortcuts, he's been backed by the foreign ministers of Spain, of Ireland, of Latvia, the Czech Republic. The Scottish Government, in its plucky little wisdom, thinks they've found a way around that. Not for them, an application through Article 49. Oh no, not that long queuing system, the tortuous negotiation that can only begin after their self-appointed Independence Day. No, they boldly state on page 221 of this white paper that Article 48 is now the mechanism for them. That would be Article 48 that has never been used as the basis for accession. That is Article 48, which would require every single member state to agree to open it and other treaties up in order to make accession happen. And Article 48, under which the Scottish Government would have no way to trigger a treaty change because only member states, the Parliament or the Commission have the power to do that. So the Scottish Government would have to ask someone else to do it for them. But the Scottish Government does have some good grace. It acknowledges that, and I quote, "It will be for EU member states meeting under the auspices of the Council to take forward the most appropriate procedure under which an independent Scotland will become a signatory to EU treaties." Presiding Officer, they want to change the rules of the club before it becomes a member in order that it can jump the queue of membership, but it recognises it doesn't get to decide the route it wants to take. It's up to the other club members to decide that route for them. So let's look at what the club has been saying overnight, shall we? The official response from the Commission spokesman was, and I'll quote again, "I can specify that the treaty provides some clear articles when it comes to the need for a new third country to apply to the EU if they want to join." He then added, "Any process of a particular region of a member state leaving that member state will have treaty implications, and that Brussels', and I quote again, well-known position on this had not changed, i.e. we're right back to Barroso's statement last September." But it wasn't just the Commission spokesman. No. The BBC's Europe editor, Gavin Hewitt, has been a pretty busy man. He's been speaking to all sorts of officials in Brussels. So let me read his report this morning. European officials have made clear that any new country would have to reapply for EU membership. In the case of Scotland, it would first have to complete financial negotiations with the UK. Only then would Scotland be able to approach Brussels and formally apply for membership. So European officials stating that Scotland doesn't even get to approach the EU for membership until after it's finished all of its negotiations with the UK over currency, over the regulator, over the lender of last resort, over the Bank of England, over 100 other issues. And then here's when we get to my favourite part of the Scottish Government's European plan. The fact that all this will be done in just 18 months. Negotiations with the UK completed in time to start a formal membership application, which would require each of the institutions of the EU and every one of the 28 other member states, each one holding a veto, to agree to change the founding treaty, to open up and amend a number of other treaties, to agree with all the opt-outs secured by Britain that the SNP wants to keep, to add to the commissioners, to add to the voting. All of that in a matter of mere months, when from application to accession it takes states on average 8 years to join. This from a Scottish Government that has spent 18 months trying and failing to get EU agreement on alcohol minimum pricing. If the Scottish Government... I'm sorry, I'm in my final minute, First Minister.
The members in their final minute.
If the Scottish Government can't get through one policy from one portfolio in 18 months, what chance does it have of negotiating membership in its entirety on the same timescale? So the Scottish Government are desperate to prove that they don't have to come out of Europe before they get to go back in. They're now contorting themselves in every possible way to find any straw at all to grasp on this issue, but the weight of the evidence just doesn't stack up. The Commission President says an independent Scotland would have to reapply. Officials say that application can't happen until financial negotiations with the UK Government about a separate state are complete. The Foreign Ministers of Spain, of Ireland, of Latvia and the Czech Republic say Scotland cannot jump the queue. In history, 22 countries have joined Europe's club. The average joining time has been 8 years and 4 months. It could be pretty lonely for a newly independent Scotland starting life on Europe's northern fringe. I support the amendment to this motion.
We now move to the open debate. Time is tight. Can I ask members to confine their remarks to their allotted time? I call Mark MacDonald, followed by Ian Gray.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. This is a debate about vision and the delivery of that vision. Yesterday, the Scottish Government outlined how independence will be delivered and outlined how the powers of independence will be used by a Scottish Government that is led by the Scottish National Party. It's worth reflecting on the journey to this point, Presiding Officer, not just since May 2011, but over many decades. Many committed activists have worked exceptionally hard in times when the establishment of a devolved parliament, let alone an independence referendum, was but a distant hope at that time. People who had doors slammed in their faces during the days when the Scottish National Party did not command strong electoral support. This moment in history, Presiding Officer, belongs to those on whose shoulders we stand, many of whom did not live to see this day. I have always believed, well, I'll give way to the member on that point then.
John Lamont.
Yeah. One of those activists, of course, was Jim Sillars, who said to be a separate independent Scotland, you need a separate currency. What is his legacy for you?
Mark MacDonald.
Well, I'll learn from that mistake, Presiding Officer, not to let the Labour leader in again when trying to make, I think, what was a very serious reflection on the hard work of many that led to this point. And it should be worth noting that unless I've picked him up wrong, Jim Sillars intends to vote yes in the referendum next year, irrespective of the points that the Labour leader is making. I have always believed, Presiding Officer, from the moment I became politically aware, that Scotland should be independent. My reasoning has evolved as I've grown older, and now, as the parent of a disabled child, I see the world through different eyes. I look to the two futures that are available to my son and to others like him. That which the Union offers, of being regarded as a burden on the taxpayer, of parties competing over who can subject the vulnerable to the harshest welfare regime. Indeed, only recently we saw the headline in the, I think it was in The Observer, where Rachel Reeves, the DWP spokesperson for the Labour Party, is now promising a tougher welfare system than that currently being administered by the Tories. I don't want a tough welfare system, I just want a fair welfare system for the people of Scotland. Because that is not the future I want for my son or any other vulnerable citizen in Scotland. Now, I heard Joanne Lamont on Radio 4's Any Questions programme from Bearsden, and one of the remarks she made struck a chord with me. She spoke about how wasn't it great that this Parliament had been delivered and was able to protect the National Health Service in Scotland from the reforms that were taking place south of the border. In essence, wasn't it great that the NHS in Scotland was controlled in Scotland? Yet when vulnerable people leave our hospitals and our GP surgeries and enter the clutches of Westminster welfare reform, according to Joanne Lamont, that's all right. She cannot make the logical step from having health protected by this Parliament to having other forms of social protection controlled by this Parliament. But I believe that we can do better by our vulnerable. The White Paper itself acknowledges that welfare is to be viewed as a social investment designed to promote equality, fairness and social cohesion, not just as a safety net, but also as a positive investment in people. It sets out clear goals, policy goals that the government would pursue were the SNP elected, whether it is to abolish the bedroom tax, whether it is to cancel universal credit and personal independence payments. These are real, tangible policies, real choices which we can make with the powers of independence to ensure that the same protection afforded to our vulnerable through a Scottish-controlled health service is afforded to them through a Scottish-controlled welfare system. It is an opportunity to recognise the value of all of our people through a system that values all of our people, truly a system that would deliver from cradle to grave. And that's the point about the childcare policy as well, and the point that the other parties seem to be having difficulty with, is that in order to invest the sums that will be required to deliver that transformational change, we require to have control of Scotland's revenues. We don't require what is currently being operated by Westminster, which is an ever-diminishing block grant subject to the whims of austerity-mad politicians at Westminster. We need the full power of Scotland's resources to deliver the full range of powers for the people of Scotland. And that is the essence of independence. It is about Scotland's people controlling Scotland's future and Scotland's government delivering for Scotland's people. It is about investment in bairns, not bombs. It is about attracting talented people to come to Scotland, not booting talented people out of Scotland. It is about protecting the vulnerable, not humiliating and degrading them. That is essentially what independence is about. It is the step that we take, that we say to the Scottish people, we trust you, and they put their trust in those who they elect to govern to take decisions for them. We do not have the system where decisions on Scotland's behalf are taken by people who did not ask what Scotland wanted them to do on Scotland's behalf. We need only look at what happened in terms of the Common Agricultural Policy decision to see that we have that system in operation, where government officials and ministers at Westminster take decisions on behalf of Scotland with nary a care for what the impact will be on Scotland.
Okay, bring your remarks to a close, Ms MacDonald.
Absolutely, Presiding Officer. With control of the powers of independence, we can take decisions on behalf of the people of Scotland that reflect the values of the people of Scotland. That is the society I want for my children.
Ian Gray, followed by Willie Rennie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Scotland's finances and the economy are central to this debate. We've heard much of that already in the opening remarks. The White Paper makes much of figures showing that tax receipts in Scotland are higher than in the UK as a whole. True. However, rather less is made of the equally important fact that public spending is also higher. And last week, the IFS showed that these same figures mean an independent Scotland would face higher tax increases or greater cuts than the UK. That true even on their most optimistic case, heroically optimistic in fact, using the SNP's lowest estimate of our share of UK debt and using the SNP's own highest oil projections. The calculation shows the cost would still be in taxation £1,000 a year for every Scottish taxpayer. So the White Paper has the numbers, but it refuses to face the arithmetic of independence. Of course, I understand that the Scottish Government dismisses these figures because, they argue, a separate Scotland will suddenly grow stratospherically, and the First Minister asserted that again today. But the White Paper is disturbingly vague on why that should be expected to happen. It suggests a corporation tax cut no one but the SNP believes in, a small business national insurance scheme which already exists and hasn't worked, and a childcare pledge which the SNP could deliver today if they really cared, and the First Minister had to take 10 minutes today to justify and apologise for his failure to have done so. But what this document is clear about is the fundamental platform Scotland's prosperous future requires.
First Minister.
Since John Lamont didn't answer the question, can Ian Gray now answer it? The £700 million required to bring about the transformation of childcare prospects in Scotland, we've identified how that would happen through increased revenues, through increased female participation in the labour force. That happens under independence. How could it happen under devolution? How would you find the £700 million required?
Well, let's start by finding the resources to deliver the 2007 childcare pledge that in 6 years the First Minister hasn't managed to deliver. But this document is clear about the fundamental platform our future requires. We will retain the pound, it says, and the Bank of England will be our lender of last resort in case the banks fail again. On that financial sector, still so important to Scotland's economy, we will retain a broadly integrated market. And as for energy, Scotland will continue to operate in the Great Britain-wide market for electricity and gas, just as well, since we succeed in attracting a third of the subsidies paid for by consumers across the UK. And we will have a single transmission operator paid for by consumers across the UK. And for good measure, the Green Investment Bank will continue on a UK-wide basis too. Or Scotland's universities, engines of economic growth, winning up to 15% of available research funding, way above our share. Just as well, then, the White Paper says these UK-wide arrangements will continue after independence. Why? Well, just because it says so in the White Paper. And a modern workforce also needs the ability to move freely across borders. So, of course, we will continue with the common travel area, except that all the evidence is that even where borders remain open, cross-border flows of people and trade will plummet when countries separate by as much as two-thirds in the case of Czechoslovakia. And last week, we debated the importance of UK defence contracts, not least to shipbuilding. The White Paper, no surprise, says these contracts would continue, but we know the workers whose jobs depend on them say clearly that they would not. This document offers no evidence that these things would continue post-independence. It simply asserts that because the SNP argument needs it, and wishes it to be so, it will happen. Indeed, if wishes were horses, the First Minister would this afternoon be riding at the head of a veritable cavalry regiment for the new Scottish Defence Force. There is no reason to believe and no guarantee that the rest of the UK would tailor its currency to our needs, subsidise our renewable industry or fund our research rather than theirs, far less build warships here in a separate country for the first time in the Navy's peacetime history just because it suits us. And to pretend otherwise is simply dishonest. Now, the SNP, I'm sorry, the First Minister's took about a minute. The SNP say that those who reject separatism should describe our vision for Scotland's future. But the argument that we are better together runs through their own white paper. A single currency, risk shared, free trade, free movement, an energy market of 60 million for our renewables, access to 10 times the research contracts we could command, and defence contracts running into billions of pounds. That is the foundation of our prosperity. And what happens if we vote no? We keep these things. Not maybe, not perhaps, not subject to negotiation, but guaranteed. This is the better together case. It is no. The SNP
Mr. Gray is winding up.
The SNP. It is the SNP who think that we are too small, too weak, too oppressed to seize the opportunities of the United Kingdom and the world beyond in order to thrive. But the truth is, Scotland has always been smart enough, skilled enough, imaginative enough and brave enough to stand tall in the United Kingdom, not just to survive but to lead and to prosper, as we do today in renewables, defence, universities and so much more. If all these UK markets and institutions in here are so vital to our prosperity, isn't it just common sense to stay in the United Kingdom and seize the opportunity they give us?
Will Rennie, followed by Christina McKelvey.
So true to form, it's day 2 of the happy clappy sect, starry-eyed optimism worshipping the god of positivity. Alex Salmond, the patron saint of blind optimism. I have to say, I loved the optimism on childcare. It's what I've been asking the First Minister to endorse week after week after week after week. I don't know how many weeks it went on for, but only when it can aid his campaign for independence does he start to listen. They are letting down a generation of young people if they don't act now, with the powers of devolution they once trumpeted, but they're now deriding. The childcare package was one part, not just now, it was one part of a wider offer that insisted there would be no downsides to independence. In the White Paper, there was not one single example of anything that even might be slightly difficult under independence. This omission is quite striking. It makes you wonder why all the states of the world are not immediately deciding to break themselves up based on this compelling case put forward yesterday. Perhaps now the White Paper for Independence Revolution will now engulf the world. I can't think of any examples of modern successful countries that have broken themselves up. The former Soviet bloc nations or war-torn countries of Africa were hardly modern successful countries with much to lose. Hardly examples for a modern successful Scotland to follow. Scottish independence is not normal.
I don't think the member wishes to give way. Please resume your seat.
So the stakes are high. And yesterday's White Paper did not move us on. It didn't reduce the risk. It didn't help us answer the serious questions being raised about this colossal step. The First Minister said that Scotland is better prepared for independence than any other country in the world. I was surprised he was so modest. I thought he was going to go on to say the universe. But being prepared normally means being prepared for all eventualities. So let's look at some of those possibilities. Not just now. I want to establish if the SNP have even considered what happens
Salmond.
if their assertions about what will happen don't happen? I'll come to him in a second. Perhaps he can answer the questions that he's failed to answer in his white paper that I'm about to read out. What if the remainder of the UK says we can't use the pound as part of a currency union? Is there a backup plan? What happens if we form a fiscal pact with the UK, but they insist we can't borrow or spend any more? What happens to the Clyde if the MOD orders go elsewhere? What happens to funding for our universities if the UK funding dries up? What happens if the UK doesn't want to buy our energy? Is the First Minister going to, for once, answer any of those questions? I'll take his intervention.
First Minister.
What would happen is the lights would go out in England and nobody would want that. Certainly, I wouldn't advocate it. But can he answer just that simple question? We've set out how that transformation in childcare can be funded with independence by revenues coming in to the Scottish Exchequer. Can he explain to this chamber how such a transformation, £700 million, could be found and funded under devolution?
I say this very gently to the First Minister. Very gently to the First Minister. If he can't even be trusted to match England on childcare, why should I believe a single word that he says on childcare for 10 years' time? How can I believe a word that he says? And I noticed, yet again, he failed to answer the other 5 questions that I asked. And I'm happy to take another intervention if he wants to answer the question about the Clyde, about the universities, about the fiscal pact, about the currency. He has no answers for these things. He hasn't thought about the eventualities. These are serious and reasonable questions that most people would have hoped the SNP would answer in the white paper. But none of these reasonable options have even been considered, and they are certainly not sharing them with us. The SNP believe they have a right, and that they are right, on everything and everyone else is wrong. It's based on an assumption that the UK will agree to every single demand from a newly independent country. The SNP believe that people in the UK will take orders from a First Minister who has spent 3 years, probably 80 years, condemning them before declaring we want to be independent from them. If we slam the door in their face, they may just lock the door from the other side. And that is just about the UK. The SNP expect the other countries of the EU and NATO will take our instructions as well. And the First Minister dodged my question earlier on when I intervened in his speech. Has he received any communications from any other country in the European Union about Scotland's membership of the European Union? Have they indicated at any stage that it may be difficult? He dodged the question. Perhaps he doesn't want to give me the answer, like so many of the other questions that I have been posing. The SNP, if they are seriously expecting any kind of shift in the opinion polls, need to start answering the questions that have been posed. There is little point in talking about anything else until they fundamentally address the fundamental problems with an independent Scotland. Thank you.
Christina McKelvey, followed by James Kelly. Ms McKelvey's mic, thank you.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, this is the day, our day, Scotland's day, the day that we can cradle in our arms Scotland's future and hear the infant cries of a new country. On the 18th of September 2014, we will dispatch our child off to a new kind of school, one that recognises the worth of every single infant and one that gives her wings to fly. The greatest gift you can give your children are the roots of responsibility and the wings of independence, says Dennis Waitley in The Psychology of Winning. Maybe some of my colleagues in here should read it. In an independent Scotland with 1,140 hours of free childcare, we won't be clipping any wings. We'll be giving them the power to fly and fly with confidence. And here we have set down the structures to make it work. We are shining a torch upon our ambitions, showing everyone what a prosperous, fair and equal society would look like. That prospect excites me. It represents the values I hold dearest, and it tells me not only that an independent Scotland can work, but that it will work. Presiding Officer, this is no vague concept or woolly notion. These 670 pages are of intricate detail. Maybe some people should read it. Scotland's future isn't a quick bedtime read. It's a blueprint for a future, and every one of us should study it. Now we can see in concrete, verified terms what we can do as an independent nation, and I am immensely proud to see it projected out to every citizen in this country. Presiding Officer, we can have space at the world's tables of power. We can be heard in Europe, at the UN and on international matters. We can build a successful economy out of our own resources. We can be a country that is caring and compassionate. We can be exemplars to the rest of the world. We can prove that with the power to make all of our own decisions, we are innovative, thoughtful and strategic long-term thinkers. And above all, we will be able to genuinely reflect the demands of the electorate. It is they who will give us the power to succeed. No longer will the people of Scotland be ruled by governments in Westminster whom we did not elect. Never has the future of our country been so well considered and carefully planned. This is a piece of history. There is a strong argument that it is the most important political document to be produced since our country's nobles appealed to the Pope in the Declaration of Arbroath in 1320. All of us here are included in that history, in making that history, and we are honoured, each of us, to play a part in building the new and liberated Scotland. Is that not just an incredible feeling? At this landmark in our journey, we are joined together not only by the common purpose, but by a common surge of hope and anticipation. We will bring about the birth of a new heritage of our new Scotland. Scotland's future in a modern, hard-headed and realistic blueprint of our nation, ready and waiting to be put into action. In every way, it reflects the values as people and the confidence in ourselves grow. It points us to the new Scotland built on compassion, equality, tolerance, prosperity and innovation. A Scotland that offers every person in this land respect and dignity, that prizes free education and the right to improve ourselves, that generates wealth and encourages economic growth. A Scotland that treats immigrants with respect, that will close down Dungavel and end the practice of dawn raid, something I am immensely proud of. We will end the inhumane treatment of those who have exercised their legitimate right to seek asylum. Westminster has diminished many of these. They also have diminished key aspects of workers' rights. On independence, we will restore a 90 days consultation period for redundancies affecting 100 or more employees. That right was taken away by the Tories, backed up by that lot over there. And what will this add up to? A Scotland that is free of the stifling hand of Westminster Government, that says it wants us, but with one hand and ignores our needs with the other. We will be able to dump the policies inflicted upon us and that we know do not reflect our priorities. We will be in charge of our own destiny. A future in our own place in Europe with at least 11 MEPs instead of the current 6, with a Commissioner and a greater voice in Brussels and Strasbourg to protect and grow our interests there. Europe has been good for smaller member nations. I can't stand the people in here who think it's okay to slag off smaller nations. We have proof of that. Ireland, Estonia, Latvia, Slovenia, Lithuania, which currently holds the EU presidency, and Croatia, which joined us only this summer. They are young, independent nations, proving that playing an active part in the global bloc of more than 550 million people is working. I don't notice any of these countries seeking to go back to the old days of being part of a larger Big Brother. Presiding Officer, I was speaking at the Radical Independence Conference the weekend, and that group have a declaration, and it summed it up perfectly. Yes is a hope fashioned from knowledge. We know a better economy is possible because we have seen it in other nations. We know greater equality among citizens is possible because we have seen it in other nations. We know that ending poverty, reviving democracy and respecting our environment are possible because we have seen those things too. And we know how to bring those things to Scotland. We must abandon 30 years of Thatcherite politics of exploitation, the damning, corrosive exploitation that makes a few rich and the many lose. We must replace it with the politics of sharing, where we all gain from the riches of our land.
Let us hear the member, please.
It is a fine Scottish tradition to find out what works, how it works and how we can make it better. For centuries, Scotland's ingenuity has been a gift to the world. Now let's gift it to ourselves. Let us gift ourselves the economy. Let us look at the forces that stand behind no, and let us look at the forces that stand behind yes. And I tell you today to choose your side. We have a solid case, we have the self-belief and we have the confidence. Now let's make it happen.
James Kelly, followed by Marco Biaggi.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the opportunity to take part in this afternoon's debate and to examine the White Paper, because there is no doubt that we do have to look at the height of the 670 pages against the reality, because the reality is that this document lacks detail, it's full of assertions and it is riddled with inconsistencies. You just need to look at the transport section. There's very little on buses. Maybe we're not doing buses in an independent Scotland. It tells us that high-speed rail is going to be a priority, but there's nothing about how that will be funded, where the billions of pounds will come from in an independent Scotland for high-speed rail. And it also tells us that the road networks will be dualled by 2030, but that road travel will be decarbonised by 2050. Maybe we're going to knock down all those dual roads by 2050. It also puts off the difficult questions to another day. The document acknowledges that fuel poverty is a very real problem. Indeed, with 29% of Scottish households in fuel poverty, it's right, it is a very real problem. And perhaps it's very unfortunate that we're only able to get 3/4 of a page out of the 670 pages on fuel poverty. No, thank you. And on that, the answer is we'll set up an expert commission. That's what will examine the issues which will give us the answers on fuel poverty in an independent Scotland. But let me look at one issue which affects every constituency, which affects every MSP in a bit more detail, and that is one of housing. Because the reality for Scotland on housing is that we currently have 155,000 on housing waiting lists. On current trends, we're 160,000 houses short of the 465,000 houses required by 2035, and we only built 14,881 houses last year, the lowest since World War II. We've got a housing crisis, and these are not my words, they're the words of Homes for Scotland. I give way to Kevin Stewart.
Kevin Stewart. I wonder if Mr Kelly could tell us how many council houses the Liberal administration built between 1999 and 2007.
Order, James Kelly.
Order,
please.
Perhaps, Presiding Officer, we would be better bringing the Housing Minister to the Parliament to discuss Scotland's housing crisis, because I see the Housing Minister shaking her head. But in her time, I give way to the Housing Minister.
Minister.
Will the member accept that there have been more houses built under this SNP administration than there was under previous administrations when they had the budget to do it?
Order.
And we've had a cut budget and we're still building more houses at every level.
James Kelly. Order.
That is not the point, Minister.
Order, and can members please order?
We are in the midst of a housing crisis, and you, as the Minister, have never come to this chamber to front a debate on housing.
Mr Kelly, can you sit down for a moment? Mr Kelly.
The reality is,
Mr Kelly, could you sit down for a moment, please? Can we please have some order in the chamber? This is a serious debate and all members should be heard in this debate. It's a serious matter. James Kelly.
Yeah, it is a serious question. And let's go back to the White Paper and let's look at this government's contribution on housing in the White Paper. 670 pages. How many pages did we get on housing? 2.5 pages. And, Presiding Officer, of course, that included a half-page, I'm not taking an intervention, that included a half-page colour picture of some houses. All we had was fluff. We had no detail. We had no facts. They told us it was all going to be solved by fully flexible budgets. What does that say to constituents of mine that have been on the housing waiting list for a year? Fully flexible budgets.
Final minute.
It strikes me, Presiding Officer, that this government are shutting their eyes and hoping for the best under independence. Because the real question is, if you're living in an overcrowded accommodation, what is this government doing? They're living in suspended animation. They don't have the answers currently, and they don't have the answers in the white paper. It's insulting to bring forward a document that lacks the answers. It's flimsy on the real issues. It's a falsehood also to pretend that these assertions can be delivered without cutting public spending and without raising taxes, where we face a multi-million-pound deficit. The people of Scotland, Presiding Officer, will see through the farce of this white paper come September the 18th next year.
Thank you. Now call Mark Biaggi to be followed by Gavin Brown.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Yesterday, the people of Scotland were presented with what is the most detailed independence blueprint imaginable, setting out the opportunities, the process and the reality of what a yes vote looks like. The why we already know. For the past 50 years, Scotland's views, as expressed at the ballot box, have diverged from those of the UK as a whole. David Cameron, supposedly our Prime Minister too, can stand up in the House of Commons, turn around, look behind him to 300 cheering Conservative MPs. Just one of them was elected in Scotland. One. As the White Paper sets out so starkly, for 34 of the 68 years since 1945, we have been ruled by governments that had no majority in Scotland. 34 of 68. That's not democracy, that's tossing a coin, and Scotland deserves better. Instead of that uncertainty every 4 or 5 years when Scotland at election time just has to call heads or tails, let's have the certainty that every government of this country must have the support of the voters of this country. And this is more than a question for pundits on election night broadcasts in studios or constitutional theorists scratching their heads in seminar rooms. This matters. This matters not least because the two parties are so close these days that it's often a case of heads they win, tails we lose. Because today we see the horror of £100 billion being wasted on upgrading Trident, the ongoing victimisation of disabled people in welfare reform, and privatisation of Royal Mail, all of which are being done to us rather than by us. Or look ahead. In the White Paper, you can see a signpost to another way on the economy, on pensions, childcare, the minimum wage, you name it. And there is no argument that explains why Scotland can make our own decisions on the health service, but must leave Westminster the rest of the welfare state, can manage justice but not security, and can be trusted with council tax but almost no other tax you might name. What Scotland is entrusted with now and what has to be set out in the White Paper for 2016? Health, toss a coin, devolved. Welfare, toss a coin, reserved. The other side lacks any justification, any philosophical consistency, and also clarity. What the no side does have is a long list of uncertainties whose shadow hangs over the referendum even if they have not yet properly been appreciated by the voters. In 10 years, will the UK still be a member of the EU, or will Scotland's exporters, in the case of a no vote, have been gutted by being wrenched out of that free trade zone? When the UK government have pandered to their backbenchers and ended the Barnett formula, how much more will the Scottish budget have been cut back? Will the UK still have anything resembling the welfare state? Will people be working till they're 70? And perhaps most crucial of all for those of us who remember the last one so clearly, will we have been dragged into another Iraq-style war for oil or even just US government hubris? There are endless broadcasts about the meaning of a yes vote dominating TV news and living rooms up and down this country, but where yet is the same scrutiny being given to the consequences of voting no? The people of Scotland deserve answers, but we won't get them, because we can't get them. And the central hypocrisy of the no campaign is to hold yes to standards that they themselves fail to meet. And does anyone think that there could have been any amount of detail in this document that would have been sufficient for the no parties? Alistair Darling could have been presented with the 10 Commandments themselves on the slopes of Mount Sinai, and he would dismiss them for saying that honour thy father and mother. Well, does it include adoptive parents, we should be told. The real purpose is obfuscation, distraction from the central point of principle, that Scotland's future should be in Scotland's hands. Certainty lies in one place, when Scotland's government is answerable to Scotland's people for its decisions, and we can be certain we get the governments we elect and the society we vote for. And by becoming two equally sovereign nations, the relationship between Edinburgh and London transforms overnight. I think it's very strange that some people argue that the UK would seek to cut off its nose to spite its face the day after a yes vote. If it would, what does that say about how we are seen, how we are suffered as part of that union? And instead of relying on the meagre influence of 59 beleaguered and, let's face it, these days usually outvoted MPs, Scotland could depend on the UK's national interest, that base interest of maintaining stability, continuity in business, and all would come to the table with minds set on a speedy and effective resolution. With a yes vote, Scotland's voice at Westminster would be drowned out no more. Scotland would be freed to govern all of our own affairs as we see fit, but work together with our partners on our own terms where those interests align, whether that's on currency, energy, mutual defence, or any of the rest of the White Paper's vision of friendly cooperation. And frankly, it is a vision that is more sympathetic towards the attitudes of the post-independence UK government than those parties that wish us to continue to be ruled by that government. This is what I see as the best of both worlds, and it is far, far better than continuing to be governed by the toss of a coin.
Thank you. I now call Gavin Brown to be followed by Maureen Watt.
Well, thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. We are told that we have before us the most impressive blueprint imaginable ever. There is truly no end to the modesty of this Scottish Government, and they even helpfully at the very end of it, at page 581, how can I ask more questions? They tell us, though, we expect you to find the answers to your questions here. They managed to go through 650 questions, but somehow escape all of the central ones, all of the meaningful ones, and all of the ones that people actually asked in advance of the White Paper. Now, the First Minister began today by telling us that he was disappointed in Alistair Darling because after an hour he was already giving interviews rubbishing the White Paper. I too was disappointed in Alistair Darling because it took him an hour before he gave interviews rubbishing the White Paper. But let's look at some of the serious issues that were not addressed properly in it. Central to all of this is the public finances that Scotland would inherit, but not just that we would inherit, but that we would have to deal with over the 5, 10, 15, 20 years in the first years of a separate Scotland. The Institute for Fiscal Studies, a heavily respected independent organisation, in their report just over a week ago said that the main conclusion of our analysis is that a significant further fiscal tightening would be required in Scotland on top of that already announced by the UK Government. That was their central conclusion, Deputy Presiding Officer. No amount of obfuscation, no amount of cherry-picking bits far later on in the report that were mentioned will hide that central conclusion. We would have to go further in a separate Scotland in order to manage the public finances and in order to balance the book. So it was very disappointing to see that we only had a single year's figures looking forward in this page. Page 75, of course, as we all know, looking only at what the position would be in 2016, 2017. Nothing about 2017-18, nothing about 2018-19, or anything at all for any year after that. How is it possible to produce such a document but not to have anything, even compared to the annual Scottish budget document that comes out within a devolved Parliament? It was extremely thin, a single page. And when I asked the Cabinet Secretary just a couple of hours ago at question time, has the Scottish Government actually done any projections at all for post-1617. He was unable to give a straight answer to that question. So I ask the government now, I don't know who is summing up for them, but I ask them this: have they done projections going after the first year of separation? If they have, why haven't they published them? And if they haven't, how on earth can they argue that they are taking a long-term positive view about Scotland when they haven't even done any of the sums? We know from the paper that was put out accidentally by the Cabinet Secretary that there would be additional costs. He accepts this at paragraph 43 of his report to the Cabinet just over a year ago. Undoubtedly, there will be a cost associated with setting up and running the necessary institutions, and in some cases, these are likely to be significant. So he accepts in private that there will be significant costs, but in the document about the costs that we would have to face in the first year of separation, there is nothing. Nothing about the costs that would be incurred. He says later on at paragraph 45 of his report, corresponding annual costs of tax administration in Scotland would be on this basis to be expected to be in the region of £575 million to £625 million. That's for setting up a Revenue Scotland capable of dealing with all the taxes with which they would have to deal. Again, nothing about that in this document at all. So if the Scottish Government wants to be taken seriously, they have to tell us what all the costs will be and what the downsides and the disadvantages will be too. No more so than when it comes to currency, Deputy Presiding Officer, because currency gets, I think, something like 2.5 pages of treatment in the 650-page document, and it basically asserts once again that we would form a currency union and we would keep the pound. Now, the First Minister did everything he could to avoid answering questions on the television last night when it was put to him. Could he say with certainty that we would definitely get the pound? He gave every answer under the sun, trying to avoid whether or not we would. He even struggled to accept that ultimately the rest of the United Kingdom would have the right to say no should they wish to do so. We have nothing but assertion, but more importantly than that, absolutely nothing in this document about what the Scottish Government would do if there was not a currency union. And I challenge any speaker on the Government or the Yes side today to tell us what they would do in the result that the rest of the United Kingdom decided not to enter into a currency union. It is a possibility. There is a downside. Of course, they point out some advantages to the UK of entering into a currency union, but there are many, many downsides too, but they don't seem to be able to acknowledge. In that eventuality, what would they do? Scotland deserves an answer to that today.
Thank you very much. There is no extra time at all in this debate. Maureen Watt, to be followed by Neil Finlay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Last week in this chamber, we had some excellent personal and indeed emotional contributions during the Stage 1 debate on same-sex marriage about individual freedoms and equalities. Today, a similar emotion flows on these benches in relation to the freedom and equality we seek for our country, Scotland, and its citizens. Presiding Officer, in a few months it will be 40 years since I joined the Scottish National Party. And to get to the position where we have a white paper on Scotland's future has been a long, hard slog for many on these benches, but more importantly, as Mark MacDonald mentioned, for the thousands of members and supporters of the Scottish National Party for many decades. Some of us on these benches have been more closely involved in that struggle and sacrifice of individuals than others, but it's entirely due to the opportunity that I had to observe Westminster and how it works at close quarters that I came to realise that legislatures and their advisers knew nothing and cared less about Scotland and its needs, and why full self-government is the only way that Scotland's citizens can be best served by its legislators and for the country as a whole to reach its full potential. That belief was further reinforced during my 14 years working in the oil and gas industry and seeing the squandering of these resources by the Westminster Government. for successive UK governments to swallow up the revenue of this finite resource is a scandal, and the only country bar Iran not to have an oil fund. But I'll come back to that. Fortunately, yes can stop this. Voting yes can stop this and begin to leave a legacy for future generations. With an independent Scotland, we would have full responsibility for oil and gas reserves and would maximise the safe production of these reserves. I welcome Sir Ian Wood's interim report on the UK CS Maximising Recovery Review, where he commented that fiscal instability is a significant factor of underperformance in the UK basin. Over the past decade, there have been 16 subsequent changes to the fiscal regime. These frequent changes, often without prior consultation with the industry, have earned the UK a reputation for fiscal instability, inhibiting new investment and, more importantly, decreasing the lifespan of some fields and, at the same time, damaging the Scottish economy. There is no doubt that operators place a big premium on operating under a stable and predictable tax regime, so that tax returns from investments can be appropriately evaluated. And this stability is important also to underpin Aberdeen's position as the oil and gas capital of Europe, a position which has built up over many decades. It is recognised as a centre of excellence in the field. In 2012, oil and gas production is estimated to have contributed around 22 billion to the Scottish economy, or to the Scottish GDP. In 2013, oil and gas was the largest single sector in the FTSE 100 index of leading companies, and a sector in which Scottish firms are leading and are global players. Scotland has the vast bulk of the UK's oil and gas reserves, which is estimated to have a wholesale value of 1.5 trillion. As well as in the North Sea, there are substantial reserves west of Scotland, including, as my colleague Chick Brodie has discovered, in the Clyde. This is estimated to be the largest conventional oil reserve in the EU and around 60% of the EU's total, and the second largest volume of proven gas reserves after the Netherlands. And yet, Ruth Davidson says that we wouldn't be in the EU.
Ruth Davidson.
I thank the member for giving way. What would she say to Tony Mackay of Mackay Oil and Gas Consultants, who said overnight that it's unrealistic to have an oil fund because of, and I quote, two main reasons: the declining oil revenues and the SNP's commitment to a high level of public spending. There would therefore be little or no money left to invest in an oil fund.
Maureen Watt, and you're in your last minute.
I am so fed up of hearing that Scotland is too poor and too stupid to look after its own reserves. On the 18th of September next year, Scotland has the opportunity to gain the stewardship of the oil and gas assets for the benefit of the nation. We can introduce a stable and predictable fiscal regime with an expert commission established to consider appropriate fiscal and regulatory regimes. We can use our position as a major hydrocarbon producer to drive the most ambitious low-carbon economy transformation in our country. Scotland has many natural competitive advantages for the development of CCS, for example, and yet Westminster drags its feet on that. Of course we can establish an oil fund, and of course we can look after ourselves, and I support this motion with the whole of my being.
Thank you. Call Neil Finlay to be followed by Stuart McMillan.
Presiding Officer, this white paper was meant to show how the goose would lay the golden egg, or how the 19th of September 2014 we would all be sitting at the bottom of the rainbow luxuriating in free pots of gold. But like all fairy tales, we were soon returned to reality, this time by the thud of a white paper that is a cross between a fantasy novel and an SNP manifesto. Two things, incidentally, that are not entirely unrelated. Yesterday, the First Minister accompanied by the Deputy First Minister and her new designer Threads, took to the catwalk at the Science Centre to launch, and I quote, the most detailed blueprint for independence ever produced. Well, Presiding Officer, we know the First Minister is never one to undersell himself, a man who can't point to a molehill without comparing it to Ben Nevis, but even for him, yesterday's launch was a bragging session too far, because this blueprint or vision statement, it depends which interview you listen to, comes with all the detail and credibility of the government's EU legal advice. The First Minister claims that the currency in an independent Scotland would be sterling. Well, can I say the currency of this document is assertion, flannel and wishful thinking. It promotes a vision of a country where everything that is bad just miraculously disappears and everything good in life just gets better, all with the simple cross on a ballot paper. A place with its economy based on oil that will never run out, where everything is green but we scrap air passenger duty and build dual carriageways, where the bank of a foreign country controls the currency, but at the same time we have independence, where a currency, once a millstone round our neck, becomes the option of common sense, where business competition, no thank you Mr Harvey, where business competition increases, but so does the minimum wage, where childcare is expanded, but just not now, where the Royal Mail is renationalised, but someone else pays for it, where we will become a progressive beacon, but where bankers and big businesses get a corporation tax cut of £350 million a year, a policy that even Blair Jenkins disowns, where an oil fund, no thank you, will magically appear from the oil fund tree, a land where everything is better, yet costs us nothing. Presiding Officer, this is the mirage, this is the charade, the fantasy the SNP expect the people of Scotland to swallow. No thank you. If we apply this principle to our own lives, our own families and our own communities, it's like saying your family income will rise, your life will be better in every way, you can have free childcare, a better pension, you can have increased benefits, oh, and by the way, you'll pay less tax into the bargain. It is simply just not credible. But the one thing certain in the White Paper is that we will see a race to the bottom on taxation. Stephen Boyd, the highly respected economist and Assistant Secretary of the STUC, said of the government's corporation tax paper, and I quote, "This is an excruciatingly awful piece of work in which every argument presented is easily debunked." The sentiment was echoed by the director of the Jimmy Reid Foundation, Robin McAlpine, no friend of ours, an independence supporter, who revealed that Salmond's faith in the ability of reduced business rates to increase output comes from a complex computer model built on a series of assumptions, one of which is that tax cuts always create growth. The frustrations expressed by Boyd and McAlpine are understandable. The SNP has yet to produce any evidence to back up their corporation tax claims, a point acknowledged by Joseph Stiglitz, one of the First Minister's own economic advisers. Presiding Officer, I reject that approach in its entirety. I'd like to see a different Scotland, one that fully finances public services, redistributes our wealth through progressive taxation, tackles wealth and health inequality and poverty, that lifts, no thank you, that lifts living standards and redemocratises local government.
Order, please.
That puts employment at the centre of a national crusade that requires real political change and a challenge to the neoliberal orthodoxy which incredibly, even after its utter and abject failure, is at the economic core of this White Paper. Mike Russell must be delighted. Wherever he is, I think he's been locked in a cupboard till after the referendum.
Final minute.
I believe we are much more able to challenge that orthodoxy if we work with progressive movements across the UK. Progressive reforms occur not by accident, but through unity, solidarity and action of working people across the United Kingdom. I want to see enhanced devolution, a position favoured by the majority of Scots, a position that would see us retaining our links with our friends and relatives across the UK, whilst maintaining the ability to move around the country move money around the country to areas of most need. That is a good thing. Presiding Officer, I give way to no one in my love for my country, but I love my community, its people and my friends and relatives across the UK too. And it is because of this, it is because of where I come from and the values that my community has instilled in me, values of solidarity, cooperation and justice. That's the reason I'm a socialist, not a nationalist. And it's for these reasons that I will be voting no. And that will be a no for change.
You must
conclude. A no for change next year. And I would recommend other people do as well.
Thank you. I call Stuart McMillan to be followed by Patrick Harvey, and we are running out of time in the debate.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I'm going to try to lighten the mood after that contribution. I'm delighted, first of all, to be speaking in this debate. The Independence White Paper. The Independence White Paper and the debate surrounding it is an historic moment for everyone living in Scotland. It provides us with a comprehensive outline of the opportunities that await an independent Scottish nation. We need an honest, open and public debate on the referendum and on independence, and I believe that the public are up for that debate. Are the politicians from the no side up for that debate? We've already heard some issues today, and certainly many more issues will be raised. But certainly it's up to the politicians on the other side to really put forward their case. We now have the Scottish Government's White Paper on the proposal for an independent Scotland. So now it's time for the other side to put up their proposals and why we should stay part of the UK. When is that going to be published? On the 14th of November, during the Stage 3 debate on the independence referendum bill, this very issue arose with comments from Tavish Scott, who I notice is not here this afternoon. Tavish Scott said, "I believe that the onus is on those of us who represent the best of both worlds, the continuance of Scotland within the United Kingdom, to make a strong case for more powers for this Parliament, as I have always done." He then continued, "I entirely concede to Bruce Crawford the point which he has made to me on many occasions that the onus is on those of us who make that case to come up with a plan. Personally, I am happy to accept that challenge." Certainly so far this afternoon, we've heard absolutely no plan whatsoever from the no side. And from this side of the chamber, and Mr Gray, I'm sorry, you never let me in last week, so I'm not going to bother letting you in. From this side of the chamber, and for the debate we have delivered on our side with the publication of this white paper, Scotland's Future. The public deserve the same respect from the No campaign. Independence is the natural choice for Scotland, and I cannot for the life of me think that wanting to stay within a structure that has 1 in 4 children growing up in poverty, or the bedroom tax, or the rise in food banks is a positive case to remain within the Union. The benefits of independence are clear for all to see. Accessing our own resources, an oil fund for future generations paid for from oil and gas revenues, Mr Gray, keeping public services in public hands, getting the government you vote for, and removing Trident from Scotland's waters. These are just a few of the many, many gains that independence will bring. And certainly, as I say, we've already heard of some others, and there will be more to come. On the issue of Trident and defence, this is where Scotland can make huge gains and strides forward. The White Paper makes it abundantly clear that Faslane will be kept open and will become the main naval base and Joint Forces HQ in an independent Scotland. There will be no more weapons of mass destruction on the Clyde, as Trident will be removed. No, I'm sorry. Unlike the short-lived Faslane annexation policy of the UK Government, which was decimated within hours and which the UK Government were forced to backtrack from, this Scottish Government provides a long and clear future for Faslane and its workforce. Now, I accept that removing Trident alone will not be enough for some people to vote for yes, but actually also accept that it will be enough for many to vote yes next year. But this white paper certainly is more detailed than that. Maintaining Faslane's future is also a strong selling point for a yes vote next year. One of the 5 key defence priorities is to reconfigure the defence estate inherited at the point of independence to meet Scotland's needs. Retaining Faslane as the fully operational naval base and with the addition of a Joint Forces HQ will sustain existing military personnel numbers at the base. Civilian posts will also be needed to support these operations, and there will be construction work required to reshape Faslane to the needs of a conventional Scottish Defence Force. And a further aspect of defence capabilities is that concerning shipbuilding. Now, the recent events in the Clyde and BAE Systems indicates the importance of shipbuilding to the Scottish economy, but also to the Scottish psyche. Scots still have a huge admiration for the industry, and they know that Clyde-built ships still produce world-class ships. And any nation would be proud to actually have ships still built on the Clyde. Page 248 of the White Paper talks of the procurement of new frigates. Page 249 also highlights procurement of offshore patrol vessels. Working where appropriate with other nations in joint procurement is one area where defence opportunities will assist the Scottish defence industry. However, the important thing is that we will have the choice as to whether we want to do that or not. Scotland will actually have that choice. Page 243 of the White Paper provides a vision of our defence capabilities after 10 years. 15,000 regular forces and 5,000 reserve personnel forces, land, air and maritime forces. This is the position that we will work towards after independence. The transitional arrangements over the 10-year period offer a sensible, phased approach to providing an appropriate defence force. But, Presiding Officer, Scotland has had to take more than its fair share of defence cuts. Defence employment has fallen from 24,680 in 2000 to 15,340 in 2013. Defence spending is £1.4 billion less in Scotland as compared to the £3.3 billion we contribute. And it's incredible that Scotland, as a maritime nation, currently has no maritime patrol aircraft and no major surface ships based here. This White Paper is a blueprint for a nation reborn. This White Paper is a blueprint for an appropriate-sized defence force. And this White Paper is a blueprint to rid Scotland of Trident once and for all. Presiding Officer, as Donald Dewar once said, I like the sound of that.
Many thanks. Now call on Patrick Harvey to be followed by Kevin Stewart.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I don't believe that most voters, certainly most undecided voters, I don't believe that they regard independence as a utopia or a disaster. And I don't think they're going to be convinced by many speeches over the next 10 months that try and portray it in those terms. So I'd like to begin by agreeing with Neil Findlay that we should not be presenting, and as a supporter of a yes vote, I try not to present the argument for independence as the best possible world that we could achieve or the answer to every problem. And I hope that he and supporters of a no vote will also not present this as a different kind of fairy story, one with villains and tangled woods full of fears and trepidation. This is not utopia or disaster. This is a balance of risks and opportunities. I think we should be honest about both, and I will try to be honest about why I think there are more opportunities than risks in this debate. But I'll take one intervention.
Neil Findlay.
I certainly appreciate the sentiments that he's expressed. Would you also make the appeal for this debate to be held respectfully? Because when people express an opposing view, the diatribe and the vile stuff that is expressed online about them is unacceptable.
Patrick Harvey.
I take the point, and I think one of the things that we all need to do is to try not to pay too much attention to the small number on both sides who behave in that way. We do need to try and rise above it if we want to change the tone, and there are a small number on both sides. The Equality Network debate a few months ago on independence in Glasgow was an example of how this debate can be conducted not only in a spirit of respect but of friendship as well, and I hope that that's something that we can all aspire to. But I think in reality most people, including many on the no side, would find things in this document that they can agree with as well as things that they disagree with. I, as a supporter of a yes vote, can find things in here that I agree with very strongly and things that I disagree with. And if I had in my other hand the no campaigns document, the no campaigns prospectus for staying in the Union, I would be able to compare and contrast. But look, Deputy Presiding Officer, here's what I have. Actually, no, that's not quite right. Here's what I have. Published, I think, on the same day, the Better Together campaign's little newsletter, which gives me a very nice crossword and a recipe for raspberry brownies. At least they're not telling us that there will be no raspberry brownies in an independent Scotland. So I might give this a try, Presiding Officer. In encompassing all shades of opinion on this debate, my party is very, very comfortable. We've had a clear majority in favour of Scottish independence for longer than I've been a party member. But we then entirely failed to fall out about it because we're defined by a different agenda. And all of us, whatever our shade of opinion on the independence question, want to use this debate to ask a fundamental question. What kind of society do we want to live in? And I think if both sides in this debate could manage a debate at that level, Scotland would be in so much better a position to move forward, whatever result the Scottish people choose. Many of the principles that the Scottish Government is setting out in its White Paper, I feel very passionately enthusiastic about. The principles they've set out on welfare, and yes, including childcare, whatever people think we should be doing or could be doing in devolution. The principles they've set out on welfare, I think, are extremely impressive and go a huge distance towards challenging the Westminster welfare agenda. I would add that there should be a greater recognition of unpaid economic activity as part of the welfare system, and I see that Jim Eadie is shortly to host a discussion on the citizens' income, which I think will spell out some of that agenda. A humane and compassionate approach to asylum and immigration. The commitment to the removal of Trident, though I do think the Scottish Government needs to firm up its language on the timescale of that commitment and rule out any possibility that it will allow nuclear-armed or powered vessels from other countries to operate in Scottish waters. And the desire to offer global leadership on climate change. This is fundamentally important, though I say we can only do so with credibility if we act more radically and more urgently to meet our own domestic commitments. There are also areas where I'll offer an alternative viewpoint, and in reply to Gavin Brown's call for someone to talk about an alternative currency agenda, I think he knows that there are many of us who accept the possibility that continued use of the pound might be a reasonable transition step, but we see it as a transition to deeper independence. But in response to his question about the Bank of England and about the Scottish Government's proposition, let's remember that the whole of the UK nationalised the Bank of England. The whole of the UK's resources went into that act, and the whole of the UK owns the Bank of England. And anyone who suggests that the UK Government, even that Scottish representatives in the UK governing parties should oppose that plan, do need to answer, why is it that Scotland would not be entitled to a share of shared assets? Deputy Presiding Officer, there isn't time to go into further issues on tax policy, corporation tax, aviation tax, on the oil industry, on transport. I've done so on many occasions before. But in closing, I would like to say that there are questions of detail on the transition which do deserve scrutiny, scrutiny which will not be achieved in depth in a chamber debate, and I repeat my call for a process of parliamentary scrutiny by both sides in public and on the record on those questions of detail.
Many thanks. Now calling Kevin Stewart to be followed by Jenny Mara. Up to 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Today in the Evening Express in Aberdeen, the comment says, "Take part in debate on future." It states, "The release of the Scottish Government's White Paper on independence is a major step on the road that leads our nation to September the 18th next year." This is the SNP setting out its stall on its vision of the future for Scotland. If the people say yes in the referendum, no doubt it will set off a firestorm of debate, one that cannot be restricted to the political classes. And thank God that it won't only be restricted to the political classes after some of the nonsense that has been spoken here today and some of the personalisation that I really think needs to be taken out of this debate. The article goes on, "Everyone in the country needs to be involved. We must all look closely at what is being offered by both sides. We must not only listen to the debate, but also ask questions about what it means for each of us. Let's make sure, when we get to the ballot box, we know what we are voting for and why." And I think that the publication of this document yesterday helps folk form a view in that debate. I do think that that document, Scotland's Future, Your Guide to an Independent Scotland, is a comprehensive blueprint for the future of this country. And Patrick Harvey is right. I can hold this document in this hand, but I have nothing from the Better Together side in my other hand. And I think it's unlikely that we will ever see that document. Because, in my opinion, that document would be the agenda for austerity, decline and decimation vision of the welfare state that we all know and love. I have to say that yesterday I was quite appalled by some of the things that were said round about some of the proposals that are put forward in the White Paper. And many folk already today have talked about the ambitious transformational change that can be made to childcare. What we have here in this proposal, as far as I'm concerned, is something that will benefit the nation and future generations. And we have heard today from others in the opposition parties a claim that all of this could be done now under devolution. Yet no one from these opposition parties, not one person, has said where that money can come from. Because in order to gain that transformational change, we need control of the taxation system, which currently lies with Westminster. I would have actually given some of our unionist opponents some credit today if they had stood up and said, you know what, you're absolutely right in this front, and we should negotiate with Westminster to try and ensure that any taxation raised through this policy would come back to Scotland to further fund that policy. But you haven't even got the gumption to turn round and actually put forward that kind of proposal, never mind anything else. And the reason for that, I think, is because you are all stuck in the Westminster rut. Now, the reality is that our near neighbours do not fear these kind of changes. I'll give way to Mr Gray, sure.
I think he makes an interesting point, and indeed that principle that where we increase tax receipts we should get the benefit from it was one of the fundamental principles behind the Salmond proposals, which we not only had the guts to propose but are actually being legislated for. I think Mr Stewart opposed them up to the last.
You know, I mean, Salmond was a joke in itself as far as I'm concerned. And let's look at what others have said about Labour's Devolution Commission proposals. The SCVO said, it looks as if Scottish Labour is only prepared to make a few tweaks around the edges of the system, rather than the radical changes which are desperately needed to meet the aspirations of the Scottish people. That was said by John Downey, Director of Public Affairs of SCVO, in response to that devolution report. Presiding Officer, we have some folks here who want to tinker at the edges, who do not want to see that transformational change. In my opinion, that's not good enough for Scotland, and that's why I'll vote yes today and would urge people to vote yes next September.
Many thanks. Now call on Jenny Mara to be followed by Sandra White. Up to 5 minutes, please.
Presiding Officer, I had really hoped for a bold and ambitious white paper yesterday, because that's why I came into politics, to look and to debate bold and ambitious ideas to improve our country. But within a very short time yesterday morning, I knew that this document was not the compelling, bold and ambitious vision for Scotland that people had hoped for. Because it was clear from opening the White Paper that it is a mix of manifesto commitments, presumably from the SNP, and assertions of what the Yes campaign would like their negotiating position to be after a yes vote. So it was a political document. Carte blanche, then, for a vision of a new, thriving Scotland, a new health service keeping people healthy, slashing obesity, smoking, heart disease, cancer, dementia, better education for every child, new industries, a cultural sporting nation. But no, it's a strange mix of a few election promises in response to Labour and Liberals' calls for action on childcare, and in response to Ed Miliband's commitment on energy prices. This is intermingled with an outline of the ideal negotiating position within the UK and the ideal outcome with their negotiating position with the EU. And on the EU, Nicola Sturgeon said yesterday that she didn't want special arrangements to apply to Scotland, just the arrangements that apply to us now. It may have escaped her attention, but the UK has special arrangements within the EU. It has the opt-out, it has the rebate. Leave that country and you leave those special arrangements behind. José Manuel Barroso has said so himself. A new state, if it wants to join the EU, has to apply to become a member of the European Union. We heard this morning on Radio Scotland that the Commission has said, as a new country, Scotland would have to join the euro. No special arrangements, First Minister, no current arrangements. At best, the White Paper glosses over those facts. On employment, there is plenty of detail in the White Paper outlining what powers a new Scottish Government would have. But that's a given. We know that reserved powers would transfer over in a new state. The manifesto bit, or the vision bit, falls way short. I don't see any particular ideas to address the persistent 1 in 4 young people out of work in Scotland. There are no commitments or ideas on employee or women's representation on company boards, just lots of consultations. Why not commit? Every day in this chamber, we hear the SNP say they believe Scotland will be better under independence. And every day they say we will take action when we have those powers. This was your chance. Gender quotas on public boards. Shona Robinson has said that she will do this when she gets the power. What does the White Paper say? We will consult on a target for female representation on public boards, and if necessary, we will legislate as appropriate. 4 caveats. No commitment. Why not commit? Yes.
It's a pretty strong commitment. Can you tell us what the Labour commitment is? Or is it just all more talk and no action from the opposition benches?
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
I'm very glad. Maybe the Minister can put some amendment into the White Paper then with the commitment. Because actually, well, if you let me explain.
Order.
We have debated this in this chamber before. The 2010 Equality Act that Harriet Harman put through the House of Commons gives you the power to do it now. And you can't even commit to doing it when you get the powers that this document promises. Presiding Officer, the White Paper ducks an honest debate on pensions. In it, the SNP continue to assert they will pay a higher pension to more people without any indication of how much it will cost or how it will be paid for. They have ignored the questions of experts like ICAS, of the IFS and others who have urged the Scottish Government to tell us exactly how much pension liability it would have, how this would be paid for and how they would work cross-border with the UK Government to meet EU rules on pensions. Instead, we have no indication of cost and how it will be met. Pensions are such an important issue for everyone in this country. We need more detail. Because the truth is, Presiding Officer, that our pension system works because it is built on the strength of our larger workforce across the whole United Kingdom. It is one of those larger shared risks and opportunities. And that is why Labour has been able to commit to eradicating the bedroom tax in 2015.
If you would let Ms Mara finish, please, then she could draw to a close.
Can I have some more time for the laughter? By redistributing money in our pension system from the highest earners to those who need it most. Presiding Officer, this White Paper falls short of all our expectations of a better Scotland. Maybe we should put our heads together on new ideas and then talk about the powers to match those aspirations.
Thanks very much. Now call on Sandra White. 4 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I'll do as much as I possibly can. One of the major issues that I wanted to talk about was pensions, and I think if you looked at this fantastic document, Ms Mara, you will see there's very, very many. Oh, you've got one, great, maybe you'll read it. You'll see there's very, very many pages on the pension on that one. But can I thank you, Presiding Officer? And I think one thing that we see constantly, one thing we hear constantly, is that the unionist parties, so let's remember, they're all together on this, better together, they just don't see. Every single one of them have commented on the fact that this fantastic document, given it to the Scottish people, basically about their future, not just mine, their future. They keep asking, we don't see this, we don't see that. Well, do you know what? I don't see anything coming from any of the Unionist Party whatsoever, apart from perhaps a recipe, as Patrick Harvey already said. And, you know, I think it's really, rather condescending of the opposition to come in here look at this and then present nothing of their own whatsoever. I mean, I would like someone to perhaps answer me, when are you going to produce a paper that says what's best about staying within the Union? Maybe then we can have a proper debate about it and not just about that document.
Have a little bit of courtesy
here.
for Sandra White, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I don't think it's necessarily just me, perhaps it's just the opposition benches over here. But what I want to say, Presiding Officer, is can I echo the comments that my colleagues have made today on the significance of this debate and indeed the significance of this whole week publication of the Scotland's Future, which I'm enormously proud of, and the privilege it is for me to be able to stand here and take part in this debate when others could have stood here instead of me, and I would hope that they would be here to see this today. Now, I think many have said before, the White Paper sets out a vision for Scotland, a choice for Scotland, made in Scotland for the people of Scotland, no more Westminster governments who haven't voted for, no more iniquitous policies such as the bedroom tax. And if I remind Jenny Marr, it was the Labour Party that brought the bedroom tax in first, so let's not forget about that. But basically a government which the people of Scotland can vote for, and a government which they will get, already been said by Marco Biagio. And there were many comments I would like to make in touch on certain issues, but I did want to touch on an issue which is raised on numerous occasions in my constituency and others as well, and that was about care for the elderly. Free personal care, fantastic, came through this Parliament, but a lot of people seem to forget that £40 million have been taken off the elderly by the Westminster Government with the attendance allowance. Now, I wonder if we can get that back. That's one thing. And just to say to the many constituents, the people of Scotland, free personal care will continue in an independent Scotland. Let's go on to concessionary fare. That's a fantastic offer for the elderly people, letting them get out and about, basically keeping them fit and healthy. Must remember, of course, it's under the threat by Labour's Cuts Commission. That will continue in an independent Scotland. And let's go on to the pensions issue, which Jenny Marr mentioned. I did want to have more time on that. I know the pensions will continue in an independent Scotland, but at a better rate, £160 a week for a pensioner. Jenny Marr mentions pensions. What chance have the pensioners in Scotland got with a Westminster government? They are getting less money, fuel poverty. It's time we actually step up for our country people, our pensioners and others also. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. And we now move to the closing speeches, and I call on Annabel Goldie. Up to 6 minutes, please, Ms Goldie.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Nothing could be more important than the future of Scotland. We care about that for ourselves, we care about it for our families, for our friends and for our fellow countrymen and women. And this debate has illustrated the depth of feeling and passion which that issue inspires. But there is a paradox that the White Paper, Scotland's Future, is not a blueprint for the future of Scotland. And there's an irony that the much vaunted guide for the journey to independence is an extraordinary brew. It is a brew. It's a brew of aspiration, admittedly, of fantasy, of fiction, of wish list, of pledges with no price tags, and some cop-outs. This is actually a DIY constitutional map with scattered destinations, enticing resort descriptions, some roads under construction, the rest blank, and an invitation to colour in the rest for yourself. Because when you separate out what in this document is presented as absolute, unconditional fact, you find an analysis it is nothing of the sort. Now, take Europe. On page 206, it says, "We will continue to be a member of the EU and will have a seat at the top table." And let's just take the first part of that sentence. What it actually means is, this is not within Alex Salmond's control, but if under Article 48 all the member states of the EU agree to vary EU treaties, Scotland may be allowed to join as an accessor state, but subject to conditions which we do not know. Now, the only precedent I've been able to find for joining this route is Croatia, which actually used both Articles 49 and 48, and that process took 10 years. And it probably would be simpler to proceed under Article 49 as a new member state, which is what every accepted current authority anticipates. Very briefly.
Mark MacDonald.
I appreciate that the member is entitled to her view on this, but would you not accept that her views on Scotland's place in the EU would be rendered somewhat awkward were it for the fact that her party is currently planning a referendum on whether or not Scotland, as part of the UK, continues as a member of the European Union?
Annabel Goldie.
There is another remarkable paradox, that my party is prepared to give voters a say in that. Your party is prepared to keep stum and give voters no say in whatever conditions it negotiates for an independent Scotland in the EU. How bizarre is that? Now, I have to say that looking at the second part of the sentence, we will have a seat at the top table. However much the SNP may dislike this, the three powerhouses in the EU currently are Germany, France and the UK. It's universally acknowledged. Don't ask me, go and ask the other member states in the EU. And if we become a member state, we're probably number 29 or number 30. But what remains is that the three powerhouses are Germany, France and the rest of the UK. So where is this top table? And what about border controls? Page 489, I want to make progress, in the Q&A section states, will we be in the common travel area within the rest of the UK? Answer, yes. Now what that means is, in an ideal world, we would like that. But if as a condition of joining the EU we have to accept the Schengen Agreement, from which the rest of the UK is an opt-out, then we cannot stop the rest of the UK installing border controls to control entry to the rest of the UK. Again, two essential issues which are beyond the control of Alex Salmond. And what about finance and the economy? Well, surprisingly, we do get one absolute statement which is true. Page 72, Scotland is currently running an estimated fiscal deficit. Yes, it is. In fact, for 20 of the last 21 years, Scotland has run a fiscal deficit. But the real magnitude of this inconvenient truth for Alex Salmond is highlighted by two sources. Now, one, surprisingly, is in his own document, the White Paper itself, because only one page is actually devoted to this issue. We get tax and spending for 1 year only, 2016-17, the first year of independence. And the question arises, why are there not further projections? The conclusion can only be that to make further projections would be dangerous, because either they would be guarded and canny as to raise justifiable fears about the deficit, or so rosy as to be utterly incredible. And the second source is the report from the Institute of Fiscal Studies, to which various members have referred. And that report lays bare the fiscal gap, the likelihood of increased taxes, and Gavin Brown covered that incisively. So when you set that alarming analysis against a White Paper range of spend commitments with no price tag attached, the complete uncertainty of our future finances is there for all to see. But there is one certainty, Deputy Presiding Officer, in the White Paper, not a certainty which gets much attention, in itself surprising given the paucity of certainties in 649 pages, but it's there. And I'm referring to job losses in defence, whether directly at Fastlane and in our naval shipyards or in the many excellent, highly skilled Scottish companies who support defence technology. Their core activity depends on a United Kingdom strategic defence facility, and an independent Scotland can neither equate to nor replicate that. And Alex Salmond can argue it broadways, sideways and long ways. Everybody working in that arena knows that with independence, job losses will follow. In conclusion, Deputy Presiding Officer, something the White Paper doesn't address is why I have to be made a foreigner to my family and friends in the rest of the UK. Why is a natural connection?
In the last 15 seconds.
Why is a natural connection which I feel to so many people throughout the UK to be severed? For the future of Scotland, my country, I reject the motion, and for the future of my country, I support the amendment.
Many thanks. Now call on Drew Smith. Up to 8 minutes, please, Mr Smith.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. This has been an important and long-awaited debate. For months, dozens of questions about the implications of independence have received holding replies promising all of the answers in this one document. So far as the Scottish Parliament is concerned, this debate should be the start of a process and not the end. Parliament may not have been the venue for the launch of the White Paper, but it must now be allowed to do its job, as Patrick Harvey said, to scrutinise the claims that have been made. The vote next September has been described as the most important decision Scotland will ever take. It has been made clear by all sides that the result of the vote should be considered to be definitive, at least for a generation. Arguments must be tested and assertion must be subject to challenge. A parallel has been drawn with the Labour Government's White Paper, which set out the proposals for this Parliament and informed the debate around it. However, this white paper attempts to be two different things at once: a manual setting out the facts of an independent Scotland, as well as Jenny Mara said, a manifesto for the SNP. And I believe it falls down on both points, but particularly as a manifesto, because a manifesto should set out a vision for fulfilling a mandate. But the referendum next September cannot provide a mandate for actions which are beyond the power of a Scottish Government alone, independent or not. A yes vote would not mean that the EU had to accept Scotland into its membership on Scotland's terms alone. The rest of the UK cannot be forced to agree a currency union just because it might suit the interests of an independent Scotland. To put such proposals, which are negotiating positions, to the Scottish people as a prospectus is to deny the very meaning of that word. Now, just a few short weeks ago, this Parliament agreed unanimously that this referendum should be held, and I've said many times that I respect the right of nationalists to make clear. Certainly, Mr Harvey.
I'm grateful, and I accept some of the aspects of his description of the negotiation regarding Europe in the event of a yes vote. Does he accept that in the event of a no vote, those who offer the mirage of some other form of devolution in the future have exactly the same problem on their hands, that it would be politicians out with Scotland who don't have much interest in spending their political capital on Scotland after a no vote who would make that decision for us?
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. The fact is that the First Minister said that the Scottish Labour Party couldn't deliver a pizza, never mind a parliament. We're sitting in a parliament that was created by the United Kingdom Parliament. We will come forward with our proposals in advance of the referendum. The White Paper is an important contribution to this debate. Sandra White thought it was fantastic and was disappointed that unionists were not prepared to say that it was fantastic too. And Christina McKelvey told us that she was at the weekend at a conference of radical nationalists who made the case, a socialist conference, who made the case, as I understood it, for a very different vision of an independent Scotland, because they opposed the low-tax regime which the SNP favour. They opposed the constitutional monarchy which the SNP support. I'm sorry, Mr Harvey took a little bit of my time, and I'd like to make some progress. If I have time, I'll come back to you. They oppose the constitutional monarchy which the SNP support. NATO membership supported by the SNP. On the currency, the chair of the Yes campaign supports joining the euro. The chief executive of the same campaign and others within it think an independent Scotland should consider a Scots pound. They will say anything. And we are told that this white paper is the prospectus, and we will negotiate not just to use the British pound, but to have a sterling union with a say in the very institutions we have just left, and with the Bank of England as our lender of last resort. People in England, Wales and Northern Ireland have the right to a say in all of this. They may not want a currency union with a Scotland which has just broken the existing political, social and economic union. People in the rest of the UK might look to the Eurozone and think about whether, might pause and consider whether they want a currency arrangement with a foreign country. I'm sure they'll listen to Nicola Sturgeon telling them that it's in their best interests to agree with her, but the decision will be out with Scotland's control. The test for this white paper was to provide certainty on the currency, but it has not provided it. Why should Scots take a risk on an independent Scotland if they don't know what currency their wages are going to be paid in? These inconsistencies do undermine this document, and it makes it incumbent upon those of us who don't support independence to point them out again and again. We've heard a wide range of contributions in this debate, no thank you Mr Stewart, on pensions, on the pound, on employment rights, on public services and on taxation. James Kelly told us that Scotland is facing a housing crisis now, and this Parliament already has the powers to act. But the White Paper has nothing to say about what they will do, or even what they would do if they got all the powers they want. On childcare, yesterday's announcement quickly fell flat because we know that many of Scotland's children will have completed their primary school education before the SNP get round to delivering their previous commitment. And again, this is in an area which is already entirely devolved. There can be no better example, Presiding Officer, of Scotland being put on pause for this referendum than the failure of the SNP to deliver their childcare promises, the ones they've made before, and it won't be enough for them simply to make new ones now. The motion we have debated refers to an idea which we've debated here before, that the best decisions are made not on the issues, not by people of differing views and experiences, but based on where they live and where they come from. And this is where I disagree with the nationalist case most fundamentally. There is nothing inherently progressive about Scotland, just as there is nothing inherently regressive in the people of England and Wales and Northern Ireland. It's not a partnership to suggest that our collective achievements, or indeed our collective problems, are something from which we should just walk away. That's not to deny patriotism, it's to put it in its proper place. Part of the shared human experience which influences us all. Proximity to each other, shared heritage, shared values, shared vision. Our nationality shapes and influences these things. It doesn't need to define it. I have a friend who is the product of two social workers, one English and one Welsh, and he's a Scot and a progressive. His values are not Scottish values, distinct because of our border. Our values are based on our experiences, the ideas instilled in us, and the judgments we ourselves make for good or ill as individual human beings and as collectives of people who form relationships with each other. And we form these relationships for a myriad of reasons, of which nationality is just one facet. It's a fiction to say that everything will be better after independence and that everything Scots like about Britain will simply stay the same, because the 90-year nationalists now tell us that they like everything about Britain that they think the people of Scotland might like about Britain. And the amendment moved earlier says that Scotland can enjoy the best of both worlds. A strong Scottish Parliament, which could be providing more childcare now, and the backing of one of the world's biggest economies, with the strength to bail out our banks in the United Kingdom. I certainly will wind up, Presiding Officer. A union of partnership, of cooperation, of redistribution and solidarity, sharing risk and pooling resources. That's my unionism, and that's why I would urge members to support the amendment in the name of Joanne Lamont. We all look forward to the debate beyond today, and we recognise it will be the people of Scotland who will have the final say on the arguments in this White Paper and on this question next year.
I now call on John Swinney to wind up the debate. Cabinet Secretary, you've got till 5 o'clock.
Presiding Officer, can I begin with the comment that was made by Mr Harvey about the tone of the debate? And I think it's very important as we go through the discussions around the constitutional future of Scotland that the debate is handled in a courteous and effective fashion. The only cheap jibe I'll make is that sounded just a little bit rich coming from Neil Findlay, but we all live in hope of the years to come. Now, I've managed in the course... Oh, of course, yes.
Neil Findlay.
Can I ask him who today I was discourteous to?
Well,
Cabinet Secretary.
Let's just say this form, Mr Findlay, this form. I've managed in the course of the last few weeks to have debates with Ian Gray in Dundee, with Murdo Fraser, who I don't think is in the chamber just now, in Cooper. Later on this evening I'll be having one with Mr Brown, followed up by another one with Ms Lamont. So I intend to go through this debate on the basis of a courteous tone to explore the issues that I think are faithfully set out in the White Paper in front of the people of Scotland. I don't think the debate is enhanced by the kind of remark that Annabel Golding made there, where she characterised the fact that this debate forces her to consider her relations south of the border to become foreigners. I just don't think that reflects the type of experience that we all have of having friends and relations that live north and south of the border, and under the arrangements that will pervade as a consequence of independence, we will still be able to maintain all of those contacts, all of that communication, all of those relationships unimpaired by what has happened as a consequence of our constitutional choice. Now, Drew Smith made a couple of remarks that I want to pick up on, and one of them was where he criticised the diversity of opinion that is expressed on the yes side of the argument. Some points about what Mr Harvey's party believe, what the Socialists believe, what members of the Scottish National Party believe. And his argument, I can only assume, is that on one side of the argument we must be all absolutely and completely united and cohesive in what we believe. So if it is good enough for us, it is then good enough for the other side of the argument. I'll give way in a moment. Which means that I assume Mr Smith must be quite comfortable to be alongside the Conservatives and the Liberals on the welfare reform agenda, the bedroom tax agenda, the austerity agenda, and all that goes with it, because he simply cannot expect there to be a level of cohesion on this side of the argument without him being tarred with exactly the same brush.
Smith.
Very grateful to Mr Swinney for giving way. I was struck in the debate when Kevin Stewart said that people going in to vote in this referendum should know what they're voting for. I think it's pretty fundamental that people know what currency we're going to have in an independent Scotland, and I don't need Better Together to put out a report that explains to me that in Britain we have the pound. I've got a pound in my pocket.
Mr Swinney.
That's the proposition that people will be voting for, with the proposition that the currency of an independent Scotland will be the pound sterling, as it is today and as we will argue for as part of the process of the referendum. Now, I'll make some more progress and I'll give way in a moment. Now, Mr Smith also said that there was nothing inherently progressive about Scotland. And I want to explore this point because I think it gets to the nub of some of the difficulties, particularly the Labour Party have on this question. He said that we were all a product of our judgments and our experiences, and he's absolutely right in that respect. But we've also got our choices to think about as well. Our choices, and the choices that we make in politics are fundamentally important. If we were able to strip away the constitutional argument, there would be an awful lot of similarity in perspective about some of the economic and social interventions that are required in Scotland between these benches and the Labour Party. But the Labour Party has chosen to put in place an obstacle to enabling that progressive coalition to be able to change Scotland for the better by becoming adherents of the Better Together campaign linked up with the Conservatives and the Liberals. Of course.
In your position, you want to pretend that everybody in the rest of the United Kingdom is Conservative, which is not true. You deny the radical voices right across the United Kingdom who believe the same things as we do. It's not about being Scottish or English, it's about being progressive or not progressive.
Yeah.
Cabinet Secretary.
And we have a progressive view on these benches. That is what our policy intention is all about. That is what we take forward. The problem isn't that I believe everybody outside of Scotland is a Conservative. The problem is that the Conservatives currently form the United Kingdom government and they're imposing policies on Scotland that this country doesn't want to have. That's the problem. And you see, the problem, I'll give way to Mr Smith in a moment, and the problem for the Labour Party is all that they huff and puff about the necessity of maintaining the arrangements of the United Kingdom. By doing that, they enable the Conservative government and their Liberal allies, and with the potential prospect of the re-election of that government, to impose further measures that will undermine the quality of life of citizens in Scotland. What, Mr Smith, is progressive about exactly that?
Thank you, Presiding Officer. But the problem, Mr Swinney, is this. The SNP argued for independence for Scotland long before the advent of this Conservative government. To make this a debate about this government is completely untrue. You believed in independence before the First Minister made his announcement about childcare yesterday. You believed in independence when there was a Labour government. And the SNP believed in independence when the Labour government in 1945 was creating the welfare state.
Cabinet Secretary.
And to then pick up one of Mr Smith's other themes, he was making a big... I'm coming... Don't worry, you won't be disappointed by this one. Don't worry. Mr Smith advanced another theme in his speech, which was that the Labour Party had been they'd been the genesis of the Scottish Parliament. They were the ones that delivered the Scottish Parliament. So if we follow that to the logical conclusion, the Labour Party in Scotland believed that there was a need for democratic self-government in Scotland to control the health service in Scotland, to control the education service, to control the local government service, to control the transport service, to control rural affairs, to control justice, to make sure those issues were handled in the hands of the people of Scotland at a time when there was a Labour government in the United Kingdom. And I simply put the proposition, if the Labour Party believed in Scotland that there was a need for democratic self-government over these issues, why on earth is there not a need for democratic self-government over the issues of welfare, the economy and all the other issues that can deliver a progressive agenda in Scotland? Now, In the course of today's discussion, we've had a lot of arguments around about the question of the childcare provisions. And this government, of course, has inherited 412 hours of childcare provision. We increased it to 475. We've got a budget in front of Parliament that puts that level up to 600 hours in 2014-15. So we are making progress on the delivery of childcare in Scotland. On not one occasion, in the 6.5 years that I've been the Finance Minister of this Parliament, has the Labour Party ever come to me and argued for one more farthing to be spent on childcare than the government was planning to put in place. So forgive me for being a bit cynical about the sudden conversion to childcare on the benches over here on the Labour Party. Now, Mr Kelly, I noticed that nobody got up to intervene on me on that point, so they know it to be absolutely factually correct. Now, well, I will actually initiate childcare, yes.
Briefly, Mr Rennie.
The Finance Secretary will know that in every single budget I have argued that he should allocate more for childcare. On every single opportunity, he has rejected that. Will I get a different response in this budget?
Until of an idea of where the money is coming from, then yes, he might get a different idea in the budget. Now, Mr Kelly made a speech about housing and the fact there was a need for us to do more on housing and all the rest of it. Now, let me just give Mr Kelly a couple of facts. There were 3,724 new council houses completed by the SNP government up until 2013. How many were completed by the Labour Party? 6. Mr Kelly's administration completed 23,326 housing association homes. We've completed 27,023 over the same period. And I simply put it to Mr Kelly that one of the things that has inhibited us in making more progress on housing is the Tory government in London has slashed our capital budget by £1 billion each year. The purpose of independence is to give us control over our capital budgets and not have them axed by the Tory government that lot are associated with.
That concludes the debate on the Independence White Paper. The next item of business is consideration of business. Order! Order, please. The next item of business is consideration of business motion 8409 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau setting out a business programme. Any member who wishes to speak against the motion should press the request to speak button now. And I call on Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 8409.
Moved.
No member has asked to speak against the motion. Therefore, I now put the question to the Chamber. The question is that motion number 8409 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed to. The next item of business is consideration of a Parliamentary Bureau motion. I'd ask Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 8411 on the designation of a lead committee.
Formally moved.
The question on this motion will be put at decision time, to which we now come. There are 3 questions to be put as a result of today's business. The first question is amendment number 8407.1 in the name of Joanne Lamont, which seeks to amend motion number 8407 in the name of Alex Salmond on the Independence White Paper be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is not agreed. We move to vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 8407 in the name, point 1 in the name of Joanne Lamont is as follows: yes 54, no 67. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed to. The next question is that motion number 8407 in the name of Alex Salmond on the Independence White Paper be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is not agreed. We move to vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on motion number 8407 in the name of Alex Salmond is as follows. Yes, 67. No, 54. There were no abstentions. The motion is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion number 8411 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on the designation of lead committee be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. That concludes decision time. We now move to members' business. We have a point of order from James Dornan.
Officer, I'd like to raise a point of order under Standing Order 7.3.1. In this afternoon's debate in the White Paper, Joanne Lamont stated that this is a government which promises better childcare if we vote for independence, but in 6 years hasn't been able to deliver an extra hour of PE for our children. I've had the opportunity to check this, and the reality is that, in fact, the number of hours physical education being delivered in Scottish schools has increased substantially under this government. Figures show that in 2004-05, less than 10% of schools were meeting the PE target. Under this government, by June 2013, that figure had risen to 89%. Presiding Officer, given this, should Ms Lamont now be given the opportunity to correct the record, as she has so often called on others to do, either just now or in Section K of the Scottish Parliament's Business Bulletin, or should we instead take it that is more evidence that it's difficult to believe a single word that Labour says?
Can I say to Mr Dornan, as I have said on numerous occasions in this chamber, the presiding officer has never been, is not, and cannot be responsible for the veracity of what is said in the chamber. It is entirely the responsibility of members in their own speeches. That concludes decision time. We now move to members' business. Any members who are leaving the chamber should now do so quickly and quietly.